cultural heritage, we need to be talking about how we datify the collections that already exist. How do we make them computationally usable as well as just accessible to the general public? Cultural heritage sector has been very good about making things findable and accessible, but when you get into the interoperable and reusable questions, we have, as we discovered, some things that we could do to improve interoperability and reusability. And we've discovered that largely by having conversations with other domains about how they manage similar sorts of things. So you guys are talking about samples, I'm talking about collections. I'm often thinking about collections in terms of objects, whether they be physical objects or digital objects, but then the connections exist there.
And I think that's a really important function of coming to these meetings, to see what the other domains are doing. When we established the interest group for physical samples, it was intentionally to bring communities together that, except for these type of meetings, have their own worlds. And so, initially we started off with the earth sciences community, but we added on, the proton research, we added on people from agriculture and all kinds of other domains that had not been in the discussion. And we're learning, like what we learned through the WorldFAIR program, project, and the Duxbury workshop was really how many similarities there are, how we can map our documentation to common concepts that will allow us to integrate and interoperate with our catalogs of samples. I think it's a great finding of our get-togethers.
The Dagstuhl workshop was great. We were all there representing our different domains, and we had an intensive week talking about events and samples, which mean very different things in our fields. Particularly cultural heritage events are often things that we think of as being more public and visible, but we started to think about events as things that happen to records, things that happen to objects as well, kind of adding a bit more of a maybe preservation focus to recording all the interactions that influence the outcomes of a data set that are just sort of implicit in our various fields, but not necessarily clear to someone who is not operating in that field.
So I'm hearing a lot of resonance between the workshop that we were just at a couple of weeks ago, and you've run your session already. It's already happened here, so I'm really glad to hear that it resonated. So we were able to bring back some of the messages forward from the workshop to the meeting, so that's great. How about provenance? How much of the provenance question came through in the discussion in this week, because that's something that certainly we talked a lot about, the provenance of the material, whatever it is you're working with, kind of before you looked at it, and then the provenance after you've worked with it. Is that something that came up as well in the session here?
I wouldn't say that it came up in the IG discussion, but definitely the question about where does preservation fit into the discussion around collections as data, which preservation really focuses on identifying where digital objects came from, who's managed them, what changes might have happened in order to effectively manage those digital objects, and then how do you know if the digital object is fundamentally still the same digital object that you started with? Does it still contain the same data? That field is very good at recording that information.
So you're really tracking the journey.
Of the digital data, or of the sample, the actual physical object as well.
Well, in that discussion we were talking about the digital data, but you're right that we need to track what happens to the physical objects.
Because that's, my insight now, working with these really precious astromaterials coming back from space, that they really need to track what happens to a sample so that contamination issues can possibly be solved, and who has had it, in which room was it in, and so on. So that's an interesting connection again, that we usually focus in these meetings on something that's digital and how the digital aspects of any object matter, but here we have this interesting intersection of the physical world and the digital world. And I'm really looking forward to the session on Thursday, bringing those different types of samples from different domains together.
About those samples, I mean, they're really root in each other, right? I mean, the digital data and documentation roots in the physical objects, which in our case sometimes is the samples, as well as the kind of outputs of the research process. You know.
Beth and I just had a conversation just before we came up here about how Beth had been talking in Dogstool about events and a parade as an event, and I was thinking we could have a reaction as the event. And then, because you don't actually document the reaction. Well, you do, you document the reaction, but it's transient and you document the product of it. But you will also have your protocol and, maybe some images of the before and after and things. So I think we can also think about events in our chemistry world and in our geoscience world.
Well, in the geoscience world, absolutely. I was, that's one of the great things I took home from Dagstuhl was that we have events like volcano eruptions, earthquakes, and so on. And that concept of an event actually can link many different domains, because a volcano eruption can impact social structures. It can, there's all kinds of different aspects to this event, and that concept can really build an essential component of a cross-domain interoperability framework.
Absolutely. I loved the idea of evidence that came, what's the evidence of the research that you're doing, in the initial phase, but also, reuse. You always need to tie it back to the evidence, and I think that's something that I really learned, working together, and then, and particularly with the cultural heritage archiving scenario, where it's like we were talking about evidence of, of information, encapsulated in these archival materials that relate to completely different fields, things that, species that might be extinct now, and, and were they present and, in the fossil record, and just the ties that you can make is really fascinating. But I think those are the relationships that you can start bringing together through the CDIF, and they can be evolving relationships that way.
And it's great to discuss this here, because there are so many more people now, and we're coming with a core set of new insights that we can relate to a much broader audience, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it's going to be picked up.
Yeah, and that's one of the best parts about coming to these types of events, is that you can kind of throw half-baked ideas out there. Because,
somebody else will bake it.
We're thinking along these lines, and we need more input, and we need to help refine it. And so you can have these kinds of cross-domain discussions that help you just think about your own work differently as well. I'm definitely thinking about parades and how we capture information and cultural heritage differently.
For me now, a reaction is actually going to be a parade. And a synthesis of a nanomaterial, I'll be like, it's a parade.
I look forward to seeing that in the publication someday. But there's
just intermediates, and you've got a lot of pieces of that. Actually, we had a discussion earlier in another group where we were talking about reactions, but they were bi-directional.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's parallels in other fields.
They're different. I mean, in the earth sciences, there clearly are. There's a lot of, for example, differentiations in magmas that have interaction between the liquid phase and the solid phase, and they continue to change through this process of rising up from deep in the earth, changing pressures, changing temperatures that create that. So again, we have in many ways focused too much on the objects in the process, and not on not on the processes that happen between those objects, and that's another kind of connection.
Cultural heritage has been very good about documenting those types of processes, because we're very concerned with longevity, that things will change over the life of an object, and that when you receive something, it might not necessarily be like immediately after it was created, it might have gone on to do other things that were, if you imagine something created for a parade, it might have been used in other places, it might have been exhibited somewhere else, and you kind of document that life. But we're not necessarily good at telling other people that we know all this information about the history of the object. It's just sort of admin. If you are interested in using that object in an exhibition, or if you're interested in researching that object, you as the researcher might come to the museum, you might come to the archive and get those answers, but you have to physically talk to a human. You have to interact with someone to get that kind of data out. And that should be something that we're able to surface and kind of show to
One
others.
of the things I'm going to pick up on that in the samples session is that we know that our nanomaterials, from when we make them to when we use them and during storage and everything, are transforming. And we know that, but we're still not very good at documenting when the bottle was opened, when it was subsampled, when it was, and that will...
At least what you can know along the trajectory of the life of your...
And really just, if we can, as part of our specification for samples, really just pin down those and say, we know they're happening. And the same with the geological samples, that, they are going to be oxidized, even with the best will in the world and the best practice in how we store them, they are still going to be changing, and how we reflect that and how we...
I've seen the rotting, falling apart sediment cores in the repositories where things definitely happen to the samples. But it brings me back to what you just said about actually getting people to document at that level. It's at the moment it's difficult to even get the most basic of metadata of information unless we have tools that really make it easy to document what happens to a sample, let's say through an easy to use app or something, or it becomes a mandate. It's very unlikely, I would say, for it to happen.
I was at a session. I was at a session earlier today about data quality, and we were reflecting on how FAIR it's been a nice anchor for a lot of conversations to happen, but we haven't really thought enough about the reuse part of that. And this was the lead-in to what do we need to know, and it kind of reminds me of your whole thing about the administrative information. All the stuff we actually do know or could know if we could capture it and share it, and and how much that enriches people's ability to understand what these materials are and how they are relevant across different
But perhaps that focus on things as being events and processes will help to make it clearer why we need to be documenting these steps, and hopefully we can learn from collections, because and help collections make their information more visible as something that research can be done on. And
Can they do that? Is there sort of sensitive information in those
probably
administrative things?
That
is
GDPR and things come in.
That
there'd have to be
gets filtered out.
and every institution is going to store that information differently too. So there might be, address information for someone who had contacted to research in a particular archive that you would want to make sure doesn't go out. Like, you don't want the name of the researcher necessarily who interacted with things, unless that researcher did something and is aware that they are going to be documented having done something to that
they
object.
published on it. Maybe that's at least a reference.
That I think is a really important.
And actually, we do want to surface that stuff. We want to show that museum and archival and library objects are being used in research, and we're not really very good at recording that information.
But I think that's where the access part of the CDIF will come in as well, that they're tackling all of those things, and will actually make it much easier to sort of go, okay, we tag this part of the data set as being confidential or restricted, or having personal characteristics that identify and therefore is restricted, versus all the rest of the contextual information that can be open. So
how about closing the loop? We're talking about who've reused it and where they've published on it, or how they've communicated about that, the stories or the pathways that they've pursued depending on what they learn.
And then that comes back to inform the interpretation of the object. So the kind of authoritative record is constantly changing in response to changes that people are imposing on it.
I mean, I think this I mean, having worked on persistent identifiers for samples, that brings to me the relevance of using identifiers that stay with the object throughout its whole life, in the physical space as well as in the digital space, and throughout all the time and places that things happen to that sample, because that's how you can tie the information together.
Once you have that map, can you imagine the story you could tell? You know, where has this asteroid
Absolutely.
been?
Well, I mean,
not only physically,
actually,
but where has it been in people's...
we have just done that, you know, in using, unfortunately, still an internal unique identifier, but you know, with Apollo samples it's easy because there aren't that many, right? But you can now go to one single landing page and see the whole history of analytical work that was done on one specific rock sample, you know, and that is, researchers are totally enthusiastic about it. You know, that for the first time ever they had, there's right, and it's you don't have that ability if you call your sample 502. It's not a thing to, you know, an identifier to search with. You know?
Right.
We were talking about earlier about how different institutional contexts, like we're aware in the cultural heritage domain that archives collect with a particular structure and goal and reason and organization that informs the questions that you can ask of archives. Archives are about people. The questions then framed kind of have to go through, well, who would have had this material or done this thing? And that is something that I don't think we really have applied to repositories or to a lot of other institutional collecting systems, to recognize that how we organize things informs the questions that you can ask of those things. And sort of surfacing that and making clear, like, if you come to a nanomaterials repository and you're looking to answer this type of question, you might need to ask it a different way to get the answer you want.
Exactly. Or you might need to go back to, you know, that's where the provenance, you know, who made the sample, who generated the data, that you might need to go back and ask.
Was this sample generated in the 1950s, and so therefore what would have been done to it to prepare it then? That's
what
very
kind of
different from
synthesis
now.
would have been available then compared to what synthesis routes are available now.
We have had that in the earth sciences with the question, why was a sample collected? Because that actually determines how you collect the samples. For example, in paleomagnetism, you have to collect a sample with an orientation in order to be able to measure it. So you gather very different metadata than somebody who collects that exact same sample to do geochemical analysis on it. And I think that's a lesson for us to know that we need to give some level of flexibility in documenting everything and really capturing what the purpose originally was.
Yeah, that context.
Back to provenance.
Right.
That's the provenance.
Right. And that's almost like the squishy area of context, because you have the who and the what and the way, you know, like what was it and where was it and when was it. And I know some of those things are getting codified more in universal ways, time and place, but that purpose, the why, that's the squishy part. But that could
I like
be
that. We
interesting.
need to leave room for the squishy bits. Within the C. diff, there's a lot of structure, and there's a lot. I mean, it's meant to make our data machine interoperable, to kind of remove the human question from questions that don't really need to involve humans, that computers could answer. And we need to take all of this, though, and make sure that that travels with all of that machine interoperable data.
Yeah, and the squishiness comes back, I guess, to, you know, this implicit knowledge. So how we can, you know, we won't be able to define everything, but can we at least, even if it's free text and then it's text mined afterwards, you know, describing, and we saw in our workshop that, you know, that some of us structure our thoughts as bullet points and some of us as stream of conscience. So, you know, whatever way you do it, it should be fine as long as the information can be retrieved. So there is some room for squishiness.
Flexibility there.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this. So you have the sort of the life trajectory and map of the world around the sample, and then also the trajectory and world around the data, the digital
data
record.
this,
Data coming out of that. Is that something that's generated dynamically? be because we have this identifier that can bridge it? Is that a vision, or does the digital record have to have some kind of cohesion?
In the first place, the step is really to make sure there is that identifier and it sits inside the metadata of the other identifiers. So you have the connections, the linkness of the data built in. That's clearly the first step. You obviously want to have some high level of consistent vocabulary, terminology, that ultimately allows you to then make the connection between the type of sample and the type of data that are generated. But from my perspective, if I could only get everybody to use the unique identifiers in their linked manner, building graphs around the samples and the data, or integrating it into a graph, then we would be so much better off than where we are now.
Not yet, but I'd love to see in a future IDW type meeting some kind of like a storytelling session.
Well, we have WorldFAIR Plus to plan for this, right?
For all this cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary. And we decided chemistry, nanomaterials in chemistry and agriculture is going to be our interdisciplinary one that we're going to tackle. So
Brilliant.
Fun.
the bee pollinating the
orange.
The orange.
Right, yeah.
Plants that created the orange.
What's the object in that situation? Is it the orange or is it the bee? Yeah.
Agriculture actually takes you over to the earth sciences as well.
Exactly. To
You
soil
have
quality
soils,
and
you have hydrology, water, chemistry, and so on.
It really is. I think another thing that I would love to be hearing more here that I think we could also bring forward are all of these relationships, how you need to tie those together so that there is a pathway from the pollination to the orange, or between these two disciplines there's relationships that need to be made, and what kind of semantics needs to happen between the metadata to allow those integrations. So there's the integrations there where we probably know about them already, people, time, place, whatever, but what are
The stuff that CDIF is going to help support.
how do we expose the ones where we might not know that there's a connection yet, but it needs to be built? I'm not quite sure.
That is a challenge, because even you're connecting all these relationships between the bees and the orange in your fields of study that would really take a good look at components of that. And I'm like, there could be a painting of an orange. And that painting of the orange could have been at the point in time
With the
that
bee.
was
With the bee on it.
contemporary
Yeah, exactly.
with the bee pollinating the orange. But how do you find that? How do I write the right metadata down so that you know that this is relevant to your study?
So maybe this is where we need the AI, right?
Yeah.
Find me a painting with a bee and an orange.
Specific
orange
location
comes
data,
after
we
the
do
bee,
have
though,
that.
right?
Yeah.
Because the orange is sometime
That's true.
after the pollination event.
Of the
because,
flower.
yes, you need to pollinate the flower, and then sometime later, an orange appears.
I think also, at least in the US, and I know in Europe as well, there's a big focus on interdisciplinary research, the big questions, the sustainable development goals, and so on. So I think if we actually look at what's happening in the research that people do and ask, where are your challenges to find the data you need? We come from the real world. We tend to make things very theoretical, and I really think it would be cool to get down into the real world and say, where are your challenges to integrate what you're actually working on?
Stop imagining our users and just look for our users.
Exactly. That's the problem of users not really being at this conference. So we need to use these type of meetings to draft up plans how everybody can go back into their communities or to the projects, connect with them and engage them somehow in this process. I think that would be really cool.
That comment came up in my IG meeting on Monday. Collections professionals are doing a lot of work to try and support computational reuse of collections information. And someone was asking, don't forget about the humanities researcher who's been doing that particular type of research with a particular type of methodology for more than 100 years and kind of wants to continue to use the collections the way they already were.
Yes,
Like, don't leave them behind in this great push forward for more cool tools.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I think some of the sessions, I think tomorrow there's a crosswalks session that has really been trying to pull together some case studies. So there is one on the new materials interest group. I put in one on nano that sort of shows the complexities of, the multiple different ways you can describe crystal structures and how we map all of those onto something. And we talk maybe about concentration from chemistry being a case study as well. So I think, even among ourselves as WorldFAIR leads for the projects or for the case studies, we can come up with lots already.
We can come up with really lots.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm just thinking when you talk about crystal structures, I was just talking last week at a session on mineral informatics, and tying again the earth sciences, the environment in which minerals grow to their physical properties, to their crystal structures is another connection there. It's
So here's a collections question. How might we approach collecting queries or use cases? I was thinking though of building a collection
of queries.
of use cases, and it could be fed by queries as one kind of stream into it, but the idea of having the collection as a collection,
Build it as a
here,
collection, yeah.
that people can start seeing how those, they can come to the query store, see how other people have framed questions. You were talking about framing questions in different ways, what data did they connect to, what did they find when they asked the question. It just seems like that might be
maybe what metadata.
I just made that up.
Yeah.
What
No,
metadata is
I
needed
get
and
your
what
meaning.
the
Yeah.
commonalities are. Yeah, I think that could be really
it
fun.
could be like a template, for those stories to
Collect
That we can then use those to frame the stories for our session at International Data Week 2025.
Yeah, the problem is when researchers come to collections institutions, they don't often deliver you their specific research question.
Okay.
They'll give you bits of it, or
I don't want to be scooped. Is there
Yeah, I
well,
guess that's true. You have to go back to their paper.
Well, they don't expect you to answer their entire question, right? They're looking for a piece of it, or they're looking for. They just type in a couple keywords, and we can record and track what people are looking for that way. And I'm sure most repositories can probably show you their most popular search terms. But could we get a little bit more insight into what that search term is trying to do?
Yeah.
That I don't know. That would be interesting.
Trace it through. Yeah, I mean, one of the groups that we've talked about, I don't know if they've been active in this community, but they're certainly working on a federated data searching, also astrophysics, actually, atmospheric research. And they are also interested in chemical composition in the atmosphere, and so they are using the chemical identifier as one of their searches, but they actually, part of the workflow that they've developed in their federated search mechanism across all these different repositories is to save the query, and they give the query a DOI.
Oh, yeah, I've read about
they
this.
can, I guess, they can kind of, because that's what led you to compile data from, these 7 databases, or the next time you ask the query, you get it from these 12 databases, and so the data set is sort of determined by the search terms
by
that
the
they
search
put in.
Doesn't the fact that data systems evolve, I mean, they grow, they have new, so the same
query
query,
is
unless the data system is versioned, the system wouldn't
It
give
is, and that's what they were talking about, is how do they version the DOI that goes with the query, and how do they date stamp it, and that was
I think
exactly
they've done that with these subsetting of large data sets that, where they save the queries, and so they don't have to save over and over these hard subsets, right?
You can view someone
you
else's
just
query
run the
and
same
you-
query
just
again.
a little bit,
It's-
less computing power,
Yeah.
rather, maybe, if you can kind of pre-select it or something like that. So that might be it too.